Hey everyone, before we get started with today's video, my book is out. Debt-Free Art Degree, Foundations in Drawing. It's a chapter-by-chapter sequential buildup of the foundations in drawing that all link together that'll help you go from amateur to intermediate to professional and beyond. Links down below to where you can order this on Amazon, but you can also find it wherever fine books are sold. All right, on to the lesson. When you make a brushstroke, you are also making several edges. An edge is like the border of something. A silhouette or even a brushstroke has edges. Now, if you don't monitor those edges, for example, if you use the same brush a lot without editing the strokes, chances are you'll create the same edge over and over and over, possibly without even being aware of it. This can cause issues with visual interest. Here's a painting with a lot of visual interest. Krenz Kuschart achieves this largely with edges. Look at this area here. I'm painting over it with just a regular airbrush, and those soft edges feel right at home. In comparison, look at these edges here. They are so much sharper. The stark difference between those edges really grabs our attention. I tried to do something similar in this painting. Even though we're dealing with limited amounts of depth, the black keys on the piano are harder edged here and softer here. Likewise, this wood pattern is harder edged here, softer edged here. Harder edges can help give something its literal meaning, allowing you to paint the same thing less literally but maybe more expressively elsewhere. But through all of that, I reserved the hardest edges for the character silhouette, simply because that's where I wanted to direct the most attention. And edges are a powerful way of doing this. Here's a little example. Right now, it's all soft edges, and there's nothing to direct your attention any which way. The second I put some hard edges in there, that element emerges. It's worth noting I did not even change value, just edge. If I were to increase value contrast along with that edge contrast, well, now it's undeniable. Back to my piano player, I did that exact thing. The hardest edge is reserved for the character silhouette. It's also the area of highest value contrast. This, in my opinion, is the strongest way to ensure that the viewer interacts with your painting on your terms. And Krenz Kuschart did the same thing here, by the way. This is similar in concept to a photographer's depth of field, which has a lot to do with the lens's focus. But as painters, we can exaggerate this idea of focus by applying these concepts wherever we want and to whatever degree we want. Here's a pretty complex painting. When I zoom in on the main character here, the brush strokes that make up her silhouette are harder edged here and softer edged back here. I put a lot of edge work into little areas like the neckline. See, I know that you know that the contour goes like this. But if I just gave the viewer that and fully played into their expectations like this, I feel like there's an opportunity missed. So when I instead did that, edges were the primary driver, and specifically a range of soft edges. And this is where your brushes come in. I think of digital brushes as essentially means to create different edges. Here's a hard edge, which I'll now soften with a plain old airbrush. Okay, that's one way to soften an edge. How about we try another way? I'll use kind of a bristly brush, and this time I'll paint the soft edge along with the shape, instead of having to soften it later. All right, let's get out two more very different brushes and try to create soft edges with them. Notice that the edge, that is, the transition between shapes, is soft in both cases, but the character of the edge is very different. This is a great exercise to do, by the way. Take your existing brush set and see how many different kinds of soft edges you can make. Soft edges specifically because hard edges are more limited. They're more contained. Whereas softer edges happen over a larger surface area and provide much more opportunity for varieties of brushwork. What I'm doing here is imitating what would happen if I painted Clara with the same brush and the same edge all the way through her silhouette. The painting could still read, of course. The drawing and values take care of that. But as I turn this on and off, try and take stock of the expressive difference that's happening. This is all subjective, to be sure, but I think it's worth your while to explore it. And remember, it's not just about silhouettes. Every brushstroke has edges, therefore every brushstroke presents opportunities. I left the edges hard on these brushstrokes, and therefore they become kind of a statement amidst the softer edges. This area is full of soft edges, but I'd like to point out one in particular. I know that you know that the dress goes like this, and I'll use that as capital to do it a different way. My philosophy being that subverting someone's expectations is inherently more interesting than playing directly into them. You can totally explore this yourself without having to tackle any crazy subject matter. Here in Blender, I just rendered out the default cube. Yes, I'm the first person in history to do that, thank you very much. This is a painting I did to demo a brush pack. I'm just throwing that in the background, desaturating it, and giving it a good dose of blur to soften all the edges. Now, at this point, the box looks horribly out of place. That's because it has only hard edges, and the background has only soft edges. The exercise, then, is finding that visually pleasing balance of edges. The subject matter here is intentionally kept very basic to encourage all kinds of exploration with brushes. I'm picking brushes almost at random, just seeing what they do to edges. Sometimes I'll use brushes that smudge paint. Other times I'll just use standard brushes but press lightly on my stylus. So one thing I recommend trying is never letting an edge stay the same all the way through an area. For example, this edge here, between the light and shadow of the box. It's currently the same edge all the way through. So watch what I'll try. I'll change it just a little bit, so the edge is kind of firm in this area, then soft here, and then firm again right at the bottom. In fact, notice that all the edges defining the planes of this box are not the same all the way through. Another strategy you can think of is to find little areas of higher contrast, say these 3 areas, and give those the hardest edges. Remember that hard edges tend to pair well with high value contrast. That's because they're both very good at driving the viewer's attention, so it just makes sense to use them in conjunction. You can look for the opposite as well. Consider this area. The shadow of the box meets a very similar background value. Due to those low contrast values, I'll completely lose the edge in that area. A lost edge is perhaps the most abstract edge because you're painting nothing. However, lost edges gain meaning by putting relatively harder edges next to them. It's a painting magic trick that I just love. Alright, let's go ahead now and paint something more advanced. I'll invent a character. And I'll specifically follow the same edge process that I just used on the box exercise. As you can see, I laid in some random brushwork and heavily blurred it, so I'm working from a kind of sea of soft edges. And into these soft edges, I will start drawing shapes, but not super definitive shapes. I am still keeping the soft edge mentality, which will by nature create looser shapes. And the overall idea is I will arrive at harder and harder edges as I work. In fact, the first kind of harder edge is coming up right now. See this cool tone I'm putting on the right here? Its edge is a bit harder than the edges I've been using up till now. This helps me pull just that area into focus, and I can kind of evaluate it individually. I remind myself the whole time that the viewer wants to see ahead here. Our brains are wired to resolve images. That means that, just like the box, I don't have to give the viewer hard edges everywhere. And by the way, you are the viewer of your own painting at first. And using this process of starting soft, I feel like the design process can happen in a more organic way. Your brain will start to see things in these edges, and you can resolve them accordingly. And remember that, in this case, the goal is not to resolve everything equally in the end. In fact, if I did that, it's very possible that the viewer would be less engaged in the piece. Of course, some art styles demand hard edges everywhere, and that's totally viable. But in a more painterly language, which this is, you really have a chance to use different edges to manipulate the viewer's level of engagement throughout the piece. So here on the cheeks and the mouth, I'm starting to employ slightly harder edges and just taking stock of how the feel is changing. Now, obviously behind all this is knowledge of the anatomy and structure and planes of the head. I do have a whole course on that. It's called Understanding and Painting the Head. Click the link on screen and in the description to check out the class. There's a whole free chapter available. It's one of my best classes, I think. Anyway, back to edges. Here's more of that hard-edged cool tone on the left side of the neck. A similar harder edge coming in now on the right as well. Some of the highlights, like on the nose and brow, are getting harder edges too. And now we can really see the character slowly emerging out of the fog, but only in parts. Remember that just because a contour is continuous, like the neck, that contour can change edge throughout. There is a razor-sharp edge on the collar. Now, it's not like I do that every time. Like, collars do not equal hard edges. I just felt like the painting needed a super sharp edge in there. more as a way for me to level set, like what is my hardest edge, what is my softest edge. It's about time in this painting for me to know that range. And then once you have determined that range, you are then working within a set of parameters. Kind of like the guidebook has been set now for this painting edge-wise. With each new stroke, I have very soft edges to reference and very hard edges to reference. On a more advanced subject like this, the trick with edges is to not only evaluate them at the silhouette, but also within each brushstroke. That sounds like a daunting task, but that's exactly why the simpler exercises, the ones I demonstrated earlier, are so helpful. You'll gain much more familiarity with the edge variety and feel your existing brush set offers. So here's where I ended up with this one. All these lessons apply to backgrounds too, by the way. Remember, if you want to improve your drawing fundamentals, check out my new book. It'll really help. And I'll see you in the next video.